All right, folks, I'm going to introduce you to some things about the forebrain. You may recall that the telencephalon here was an early division of the nervous system, and that it is also known as the forebrain. And so the forebrain, in your book, they talk about if you used your arm and your fist on top of your arm to think about these different regions of the brain, that the arm coming up would be the spinal cord, and when it kind of comes up into the wrist area, then that's going to be the hindbrain region, and then perched on top of that where your fist is would be the diencephalon, which consists of the hypothalamus and the thalamus. And then if you took that hand and you thrust it inside of a watermelon, then you would have kind of this rind of the watermelon would be like the neocortex, and then the allocortex and basal ganglia region is the fruit part that's inside of that or beneath that rind portion. And so that's a nice way to think about how this kind of forebrain sits at the forefront or on the top of that diencephalon region. And so what we're going to do is we are going to go through these different regions of the forebrain. And this first one, the neocortex, which is just the term meaning new bark, neo meaning new, and cortex, this particular bark-like structure. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. I'm now going to talk just a little bit about the allocortex or other bark. And it includes two structures. And the first one, so this is that, not the rind part of the watermelon, but the fruit underneath that sits on top of that diencephalon. And so it's kind of this under part of the cortex. And so the first region that's really important beneath there is called the hippocampus. And if you look at this image over here, you see one of the hippocampi. You have two, one on each side. Kind of how it looks, it's been extracted from the brain here. And right next door, they've paired it with this image of the seahorse. And so the hippocampus has a very seahorse-like look to it. And so the Greek word hippocampus, it comes from the Greek meaning seahorse. And that's why, because of its shape. You also can see it down here in the lower picture here. This is the lateral view, and here you see it as if you're facing someone. And the hippocampus, you're going to learn more about later. It's a structure involved in memory consolidation. It's a structure that has a lot of problems in diseases like Alzheimer's disease that impact memory. The amygdala. These are two little structures. You can see it here. This is looking up from the bottom or ventral view. And so you can see where they're located. And if you're looking at the person head on from their face, you see them down in here. There's one on either side. And the amygdala play roles in anxiety and in fear. And so if you have a lesion or an injury to the amygdala, then you don't respond with appropriate levels of fear. If you have anxiety disorder or PTSD, then the amygdala does some things that maybe it shouldn't be doing to the extent that it is. So we will talk about those structures later in the class in the contexts of the different chapters. The other region is the basal ganglia, and you're going to hear more about that in some of the readings. And that region has to do with initiation of movement, and it is dramatically impacted with Parkinson's disease. The olfactory area, the olfactory bulb, which is an area of the brain where smell enters enters the receptors of the brain. And also they talk about the vomeronasal area, which is a way that we pick up on certain signals from members of our own species called pheromones. And so that is also included in the forebrain area. the lateral ventricles, which you've learned about before, the ones that are on the sides are the lateral ones, and they're those cavities that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they're also located in the forebrain region. So the neocortex is a region of the brain on the outside. As we described it with the watermelon, it's like the bark of a tree or the rind of this watermelon. It's a very thin coating on the surface of the brain that makes up the neocortex. Now, most people just call the neocortex the cortex or the cerebral cortex or the cerebral hemispheres. So sometimes it can get a little confusing because someone's talking about the cortex, they can mean the neocortex and the allocortex, but then it gets a little bit confusing. So in this case, right now I'm just talking about the neocortex. So it's this coating over the surface of the brain. It varies from just the tiniest little layer thick to a couple of just little millimeters thick. And what's special about our cortex is that it has a lot of convolutions or hills and valleys on it. You can compare in this picture to the rat, for example, which is totally smooth. The cat, which has some of these grooves, these hills and valleys. The chimpanzee, you don't see it in the video here, but this is the chimpanzee brain. Looks very similar to ours. And here's the dolphin on this side. And so different species vary in the number of these hills and valleys. So the names of these are the gyri, or one gyrus, that's the hill part, the bump part. The second part is the sulci, or the singular sulcus, and those are the little valleys. And then when you have very deep valleys, what we call those are fissures. And sometimes there's some disagreement about which one's a sulcus and which one's a fissure. Some anatomists will call one a sulcus and another one will call it a fissure, but the fissures are the deeper grooves. So this little layer that coats the outside of the brain, the reason we have these hills and valleys is because those hills and valleys allow us to make space for all of this surface area, all this thin layer that we have in our brains. So that is the why explanation about why they exist, is because they're covering this huge area. It's this little thin coating, and in order to fit inside our skull, it has to be convoluted in that way. It's like if you took the surface area of the cortex is about 4 sheets of paper. So imagine you had a piece of paper that was about 4 normal sheets size, and then you wanted to fit that into a small space of the skull. You couldn't do it. It wouldn't work. You couldn't get it in there unless you crumbled up the paper. The surface area is still the same, but it now will fit into a smaller area. So here, let's take a look. What I would advise doing is drawing this. So this is looking down from the top. This is the longitudinal fissure. Notice this word here, long. It's the longest fissure or deep groove in the brain, and it divides our cortex into 2 cerebral hemispheres. And so here is one and here is the other. It looks a lot like a walnut does. A walnut also has a longitudinal fissure to it. Here I'm showing you this image because on the next slide I'm going to have you do a little bit of labeling, draw a picture and do a little labeling. Here is another deep groove here, a particular sulcus called the central sulcus. And here's another one, the lateral sulcus or lateral fissure here. Now, I'm going to have you do a little bit of labeling. What I would really recommend is to actually draw this yourself. Draw something like this. You could just draw the brain part, or you could draw the whole face with it, and then do some labeling. So here's that central sulcus, which I just pointed out to you on the previous slide. Here's the lateral fissure that goes this way, and it doesn't actually continue all the way down. We will talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. This lobe here is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is involved in what they call executive function. This is your ability to think things through, to make a plan, to imagine what the possible outcomes could be. So people that have trouble with the frontal lobe, they have trouble with things like organization, evaluating their own behavior, if it's appropriate or not, and as well as planning for their futures. There's a very famous case called the case of Phineas Gage. He's one of these unfortunate individuals who gets very well known for something rather terrible happening. And this here is the actual article in the newspaper that I found. And it says he was a foreman on the railroad, was yesterday, he was hit by a blast. So he worked on the railroad as a foreman, and he was responsible for setting some of the explosives. So when you do a railroad, you want the rails to be on flat ground. And if they have to go up, they go up very slowly. So they blast out the rock, and then they make it level for the rails to go through. And so he was using this tamping rod, which is this long rod, and they basically, they put the powder down in there, and they set a fuse, and then they put sand on top, and then they pack that down, and then they run away with the fuse, and they light it, and then they take off, and the fuse burns down, and then it explodes the rock. But he made a mistake. When he struck that tamping rod down, it actually created a spark, which ignited the gunpowder that was down in the hole, the explosives that was down in the hole, and then it blasted it through his cheek and then out this kind of frontal area of his brain. He said, "Oh, I've got a headache." It flew like yards and yards away, and then they took him to the doctor, and he actually seemed to be okay, and he recovered. But what was interesting with Phineas Gage is that when he recovered, the people that worked with him said he was no longer Gage. He was different. He would cuss, he would swear, he was unpleasant, he was inappropriate, he couldn't do his job, he couldn't plan for things in his job. And this was really one of the first times that they started to look at what might that region do in the human brain. The next region here is the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe is involved in sensory processing, and people who have trouble in their parietal lobe, if they have a lesion or an injury in that region, they may have trouble identifying or figuring out where stimulation on their skin is coming from, and they may have problems with moving their limbs in space. That can be a parietal issue. We'll come back to a more focused area of the parietal lobe in a little while. In the back here is the occipital lobe. Now, you can remember this if you think about ocular, having to do with the eye. And here you see that I've drawn in a sulcus, but there isn't really one here. This doesn't really exist in this way to delineate this region. What happens is the brain regions are named, these lobes on the cortex are named after the bones, the skull bones that sit above them. And so although it's easy to kind of think about them as this does this and this does that, they're not really functionally organized. In other words, the parietal lobe does a number of things. The temporal lobe does a number of things. They don't just do one thing. So the occipital lobe having to do with visual information. I always thought that was really interesting because the information coming into the eye is transmitted back to the occipital lobe for processing. And it always seemed to me like, wow, look at that. That visual system is way on the other side of the brain. And it always was a curiosity to me in that way, that occipital lobe where it's located. The temporal lobe, this area here has to do with processing auditory information. People that have trouble with this area, they may have trouble recognizing sounds. This area also does some association cortex for the visual system, and so folks may have trouble with like processing faces if they have an injury to a particular region of the temporal lobe. Let's see. Okay, so next you can do a little more labeling. You see the cerebellum hanging out the backside here. Here's going to be where the spinal cord is coming in. When the spinal cord comes in and swells just ever so slightly, it creates what is called the medulla or medulla oblongata, one of my favorite words. On this front side, you can't actually see it here, but because of the ear illustration, but there's an area called the pons tucked in back in here. You can kind of see it sticking down. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about cortical specialization. So in the cortex, we have a couple of terms I want you to be familiar with. Localization. To be localized means that there are different functions in different areas of the brain. And lateralization. To be lateral is on the side. Think the lateral pass in football goes to the side. So lateralization means different functions are processed primarily on one side of the brain and not on the other in most people. So what we're going to do is now we're going to kind of talk about some of these specialized smaller areas. So in terms of localization, there's an area here, you can color it into your picture, called the primary motor area. And the primary motor area is what allows you to move. And interestingly, this is organized in kind of a contralateral way. So when you move your right hand, that's actually the primary motor area or primary motor strip that's being activated on the left side. So when you move anything, pretty much anything on your right side of your body, then that is actually the left primary motor area that's doing that. And it's organized in a very organized fashion with the different body parts. And I'll show you an image of the sensory one on the next slide or so. This area back here, now notice this is after the central sulcus, that this area here is called the primary sensory area, also known as somatosensory cortex. So soma means body. So these are the bodily senses coming in from your sense of touch, my ability to touch my mouse and move it around. That's from this particular area. Also contralaterally organized, meaning the touch sensation from the left side of my body comes in to this area on the right side of my brain. Here's a kind of a nicer complete picture. Here you can see the pons sticking out, the medulla oblongata. This goes down to the spinal cord, the cerebellum. Here's your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe, parietal lobe. Here's your postcentral gyrus and your central sulcus down the center. So this is the central sulcus reference point. They call this the postcentral gyrus. And they call this the precentral gyrus, before the central sulcus and after it. And if we go back, you'll see here that the other name for this is primary motor area or primary motor cortex, and this is primary sensory area or somatosensory cortex or postcentral gyrus. They're all the same thing, different names. Okay, and here's our lateral sulcus, there's your frontal lobe, and so on. Now here's an image of what they call the sensory homunculus. And this is if you were to take a slice of the brain and you see along here, this area here is the cortex, that little thin layer that sits on top of the brain like the rind of a watermelon. It's convoluted, so it has the gyri and the sulci here. And then you also see from this how it's organized. So it's highly organized. Here you see in terms of sensation coming in from the body to be processed by the brain. Here's the genitals, the toes, the hip, up into the head, shoulder, arm, elbow, forearm, wrist. Here's the hand. And there's your fingers. Look at your fingers in your hand. They take about a big old chunk. And then the eye, nose, face, and lips, they take up a pretty good chunk too. Teeth, gums, and jaw, and so on. Now, if we were to turn this image into how a person would look based on the cortical space that was dedicated to it, we would look different. You can probably make a guess about two particular areas that would be bigger because they have more cortical space for them. And so we see the hands take up a lot, and the face and the tongue, the lips and the tongue. Now, why would that be? And my guess is you can probably guess it. We use our hands for all sorts of things, don't we? We also use our mouths for all sorts of things. We use our mouths for talking, and we use our mouths for eating. And this, by the way, is what makes kissing kind of interesting. You know, people don't get so excited about, rubbing their legs together right here on the calf. It's just not that interesting. You don't have a lot of sensory input coming from that region. You have some, but just enough. Whereas here you have a lot, and so doing things like that can be nice for people. All right. The next thing I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you go into your previous picture, either this one or another one that you've drawn on your own, and I'm going to have you add 2 regions here. We're going to talk about these regions later, but they are important. So notice here where this is. It crosses into that primary motor cortex, also known as that precentral gyrus. It crosses here and it kind of swoops down into this part here. So you see into the frontal lobe, this what we call the prefrontal cortex, right in the very front. And then you see this association area. So this is the somatic motor association area, which just means that's a place where it integrates the information that's coming in from the body out to the body. It's creating this kind of connection spot there. So draw this in and label it Broca's area. And notice that it says for production of speech. This is easy to remember because right here is the motor area, and motor is for movement. So you have to move your body, and so you use this area here to do that. And you also have to be able to produce speech. And so having that speech area where you're making the movements of speech, creating speech, makes sense that it's near that motor area and actually part of that motor area. And then here's your other one. You're going to draw this one in. It crosses in from the temporal area, and it goes up into the parietal lobe here. And this is called Wernicke's area. And this is important for our understanding of speech. This one is also easy to remember because right next door is what we call the auditory cortex or primary auditory cortex. Information from audition or hearing comes into this region first, and then it goes out to the auditory association area to be processed. So it makes sense that understanding speech is right here, right next door to it, because this all works together, this system here. Now, people that have trouble, if you get a stroke, for example, that impacts this area, the person won't be able to understand speech. If you have a stroke that impacts this area, the person won't be able to produce speech. So you can mark a few other things on here. So let's have you mark the primary visual cortex. Here in this picture, they just call it visual cortex. You should really call it the primary visual cortex. It'll help you remember that information coming in from the eye is ushered back here. It shows up here first, and then it moves to the visual association areas where it is further processed. You can see here too that this gyrus right here, the postcentral gyrus, is also known as that primary sensory cortex. Information coming in from the body sense of touch. And then that's processed right next door in this area, the somatic sensory association area. By the way, visual processing even comes up into this region and comes into this region as well. So it's not just exclusive to each of these regions. Okay, let me just clarify what Broca's area is all about, and then we will stop for today. So again, Broca's area is involved in speech production. Wernicke's area is involved in understanding speech. And the interesting thing about this, and why I'm using it here, is because it's a good example, again, of lateralization. We know that that primary motor strip and that somatosensory strip, those are lateralized to one side. In other words, they control the opposite side of the body, the motor movements or the sensory information that's coming in from the opposite side. And speech is this way too. For most everyone, it's lateralized to the left side. So you have the speech production area and the speech understanding area being on the left. For a small fraction of people, it's on the right or bilateral. But for most everyone, it's just on the left. So we're going to stop here for now. I hope that you found this useful. The best thing probably for you to do is to fix up your own pictures, draw your own things, color them in nicely, go back through and listen again, read in your book and add any details that are needed. I hope that you found this helpful.